why Adobe is here. The answer to that is they're a very valued contributor to the WebKit project. And the WebKit project, of course, is the core of Google Chrome and a lot of other nice browsers out there. And of course, we like to share because, of course, the web is about sharing. And what I mean is, I don't mean social media. I mean, there are a bunch of mad scientists, or actually they were visionary physicists back in the early 90s, and they decided they wanted to share physics stuff, like scientific papers. So they built the first web browser and web server. And then a few years later, Mark Andreessen came along and said, well, images would be cool, and he added images to the browser. And then over the years, as you've seen, the evolution of the web has just gone better and better, and we have all these amazing features today. So basically, the web is open. And so Adobe and Google, we all work on web technology. We work with a lot of other companies as well. And so enough about that. Who are we? Well, my name is Alex Danilo, and I'm a developer advocate on Chrome. And with me, I have Christian Cantrell, who's a product manager. He's a developer himself, so he knows a lot of the stuff that you guys do. And we also have Vincent Hardy, who's a principal scientist. And Vincent and I have worked on CSS and SVG for a number of years now. So the web is evolving, and that's a really good thing because we don't really want the browser from the early 90s, do we? And the thing is that what we're seeing now is along the timeline of web browser evolution, all these new features have been coming in and coming in. And the feature set is accelerating, right? The new features are not just accelerating, but there's an accelerating acceleration. And so the thing is that what do you do as a developer? It's like, we want to help you. And that's why we built Chrome. And Chrome is built for simplicity, security, and speed. And what's going to give you simplicity? It's tools. It's better tools to make your job easier. And that will give you more time because that will make your development job faster. So we give you simplicity and speed. And that's what we're going to show you today. Now, so what are you supposed to do as a web developer? One is come to Google I/O. And the second thing is go and watch all the YouTube stuff. Go and watch it afterwards, enjoy it, get all the demo material, experiment with it. And one thing I would really like everyone in this room and everyone watching to do is to talk to us. The web is about people, it's open, we share, and we listen to you. So if you as a web developer sit around and you go like, oh, I wish CSS did that, come and tell us. We'll try and push it through the standards bodies. We'll get the other browser makers to do it, and we'll do it together. So anyway, so this is the kind of thing we're trying to promote today. More creative options. The old days used to mock up a wireframe, give it to the web developer who writes JavaScript, and something pops out the other side. Now we want to change that workflow. We want to bring on the declarative renaissance, right? So we're putting features in the browser that are declarative. They're not JavaScript. And we're providing tools so that the designers can come along and go, well, I can build that page myself. I don't need to give it to a JavaScript programmer. And so Adobe, of course, have a rich history in typography and fonts and graphics. And so the stuff that we're going to see today is a whole lot of new CSS features for magazine-style layouts, some cinematic effects, some amazing graphic stuff. And of course, we bring this all to you in Chrome, and if you're sitting there going, oh my God, my users use IE, a really old version, what do we do about that? Well, we give you Google Chrome Frame as well. So you can have Chrome and Chrome Frame, they provide the platform on which you can make these incredible new apps. The other thing is we bring tools, we have the Chrome developer tools, and of course Adobe are about to show you some new tools they've been working on. And of course with their tools and our tools, it creates a synergy that makes your workflow so much easier and smoother. And of course, the one thing that I'll emphasize yet one more time is that the web is open. The web is everybody's, and we both participate in the W3C and a number of other standards organizations. In fact, there are over 370 companies who are participating in the W3C, and they steer the direction of the web. So if you want a new feature, come to us, we'll do it for you, okay? So on that note, I'll pass it over to Christian, and he shall tell you all about these features.
Thank you, Alex. So I think probably the best way to understand the perspective of Adobe when it comes to helping to move the web forward is to look at the web platform team's official motto, which is a better web and awesome tools. And so I'm going to be talking about three things that are going to help us achieve that goal. The first of which is text. So the web is already a very powerful platform for text, and so Adobe wanted to build on that because we really want to bring magazine-like layout to the web. And we want to do that, we're doing that in primarily two ways, with two specifications and two implementations as well, CSS Regions and CSS Exclusions. The example you see here is using CSS Exclusions to have some text flow along the edge of this mountain. Here's another example where you see text flowing between different regions, in this case to make columns, also flowing along these images here. So this is combining CSS Regions and CSS Exclusions. Now, this is the kind of thing that you're probably accustomed to seeing, we're all accustomed to seeing really in print, in magazines or something like that. Usually not something that you'd see on the web. Something like this on the web would typically have been laid out in another application, a screenshot would have been taken, or something strange like that, which obviously we don't want. We really want true magazine-like layout with the web. So I'm going to start with the CSS regions, and this is just sort of a brief overview. The concept of CSS regions is actually quite simple. You have a block of text here, a flow. You have some elements here, which are your regions, and with a couple of lines of very simple declarative CSS, that text can start flowing through those regions. It's that simple. I'm going to actually start with a couple of demos to help illustrate the point. In addition to being a developer at Adobe, I'm also a science fiction writer, and I frequently write things and release them under a Creative Commons license online. And when I release them, they tend to look something like this, which is to say, ugly, right? So I put a lot of work into the story, and then I release it in a way that I'm not really that proud of. And the reason is because I want it to work on as many devices as possible. I know people like to read on phones, they like to read on tablets, they like to use all kinds of different types of browsers and machines. And so I try and make it sort of the lowest common denominator. But it honestly doesn't look that good. So when I started working with CSS Regions, I was really excited about what I could do with my own work and how I could present it in a much more interesting fashion. So this is the same story which I've applied some regions to. And you can see that I have a page count up here, which is kind of nice. And you can see that my text is flowing from region to region here, all automatically. I have some page numbers down here. If I were to resize my browser here, you can see the page count in the upper right-hand corner is changing as the page count changes. If I drag it up and decrease the height of the available space, you can see the pages have automatically adjusted themselves. So this is a much nicer experience and something that I can be a little bit more proud of. I have a couple more prototypes, but I'm going to go ahead and skip to the last one, which is my favorite. I call this the sort of adaptive or responsive prototype. And this is unique because it's designed not just to work on any size screen. It's designed to actually be optimized for any size screen. So this is the same story once again, but it uses has some gestures where you can turn pages. And it uses some heuristics to determine the optimal width for a column and the optimal or the maximum number of columns it can fit. And you can see if you have much higher resolution, it will automatically determine your column width for you and add more columns. Even the graphic here on the left-hand side is scales as I change the column width because it's done with SVG. So this layout is going to work on a screen as big as a wall or something as small as just a phone. So I had a lot of fun working with my own content with this. And I started thinking that I really want to be able to consume other content on the web in a really nice way as well. And I really wanted to be able to just sort of reflow content into sort of a magazine or book-like format really easily. So I started experimenting with this Chrome extension that I call Qualify. And when I click on this extension up here, all the content on the page is just automatically reflowed using CSS Regions in a way that I think is much nicer to consume. And it's all adjustable based on font size and all that. As an aside, if you guys went to any of these Shadow DOM sessions or web component sessions, this is actually using the Shadow DOM, so it's not polluting the DOM at all. So as far as the DOM is concerned, if there's scripts running on the DOM or something actually nothing has changed here at all. It's all done behind the scenes under the Shadow DOM. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, the Shadow DOM's awesome. Check it out. Okay. So since we're making contributions directly to WebKit, any browser that leverages WebKit is going to receive the benefits of those contributions, and in this case, the Chrome beta. Actually, I shouldn't say beta anymore. It's not in beta anymore since yesterday, I guess. So Chrome on Android also has some CSS region support, so this is a screenshot I took from my Galaxy Nexus. All right, so let's look at some code. The first thing I want to point out here is just a simple selector called content, and it has a property called flow into here. And this flow into property is creating a named flow called article. And what's notable about this is that my content is just going to be a big block of semantic text, right? So I'm not worried about creating divs that are, or some form of element that are regions and copying and pasting text into each one. Obviously, that would defeat the whole purpose. Like, that's not really flowing. You could have done that forever. So you have this semantic block of text, which is content, and it knows nothing about the way it's going to be laid out. And then I have this class called region, and it has a flow from property here, and it's referring to this named flow article, which is defined up here. So with just that, I'm able to get text flowing between regions. Now, what about getting paging capabilities and the swiping effects and the columns and the layout and all that? In order to do all that, you're going to have to write some code. You're going to have to tap into the CSS object model. And it's not a lot of code. It's actually pretty straightforward, and I'll just go through it. We start our layout with a function called add region here, and create a new region. And I'm going to set this attribute, the class attribute, to region, which we saw in the previous slide is the named flow. And this is a really important line of code right here, this region.addEventListener. We're going to add this region layout event listener to our region, and we're going to call this function called onLayoutUpdate. And basically what this is saying is if the text inside that region changes in any way, if text is added, if text is removed, if the font size changes, if the element is resized for any reason, then call this onLayoutUpdate function so that I can run some, take a look at the page, figure out what happened, and update my layout. And then just add that region to the, append that region to the body of the document. So let's look at this onLayoutUpdate function. Again, this is called whenever my flow changes within my regions. So I get a reference to the region from the event target, nice and straightforward. And then I start looking at this region overflow property. And if the value of that property is overflow, which is to say if there's more text than actually fits in that region, then I'm going to need to add another region. So I sort of recursively call this add region function, right? Otherwise, if it fits, then call region layout complete, and you're done. You can do your layout and stuff. So what's missing from this is the code that determines the width of your regions, the placement of your regions, right? The left, right, top, bottom, and all of those kinds of things. It puts page numbers and the scrolling effects and all that. But that stuff's actually not all that bad. And in the very first prototype that I wrote that in a day. The last one, I sort of built a few prototypes. It takes a couple of days. And these are the kinds of things that people are going to write. They're going to open source. I'll open source everything I've done here along with the Qualify plugin so people can see how it's done. So it's not bad to do all this stuff yourself. But we know that it has to be easier. We know that people want to do it in a declarative way. And so we've proposed something called CSS page templates. And CSS page templates really come from our experience with tools like InDesign, which is what you're looking at here. This is a screenshot of InDesign, where I've created some master pages. One master page has an image in the upper left-hand corner. Another master page has an image in the center here with 2 columns of text on either side. And what I can do is I can just add pages to my document and just apply these master pages to those pages, and they're just automatically formatted the way I want them. So it's really nice and easy, right? And we've learned from building these kinds of tools that people want easy ways of doing these kinds of things. So let's take a look at CSS page templates. We're going to look at it in 2 parts. The first one is the flow. And this is probably pretty familiar because this is more or less what we just looked at. Except for instead of creating one named flow, I'm creating 2. So I have a selector called article and a selector called timeline. And I'm creating 2 named flows here, the article flow and the timeline flow. And then I have this selector here, combine articles. And it has this interesting property called overflow style. And I'm saying page X. Right, so this line of code is basically saying, don't call my event handler and make me have to add regions and lay them out and all that. Just page X, page along the X axis. In other words, page horizontally. So the templates themselves, you use this at syntax to define them. So we have an outer definition of a template here, and then we have slots inside of the template. In this case, we have a left template and a right template. Both of these are getting their content from this article flow. And then we have a center slot, which is getting its content from the timeline flow. So pretty straightforward, simple, declarative stuff, CSS that everyone's comfortable with. And the result is something like this. We have some English text here, which is flowing from the left column to the right column. And then we have this German text, which constitutes a timeline, which is flowing along the center column. And it's paging along, the x-axis as we specified, or in other words, paging horizontally. There's 7 pages total. And all of that was just with a few lines of declarative CSS. Now, this is still a proposal. However, we do have shims or polyfills, JavaScript polyfills or shims that you can use to actually see the stuff in action and actually see it work. And we'll have a URL for that at the end of the presentation. It's not enough, though, just to be able to flow text from region to region. If you really want true magazine-like layout, you need more powerful tools than that, or I should say additional tools. And this is a screenshot of InDesign. This is where somebody has flowed some text around a clipping path here, right? Again, that's something we're used to seeing in print. We want this on the web. This is an example of it happening on the web. Again, this is both CSS regions, where text is flowing between regions, and also the exclusions, where text is flowing along the contours of this image. So where are we with CSS exclusions right now? We're really focused on some of the low-level implementations, which really involve the optimization of algorithms that flow text around polygons and inside of polygons. And I'll actually show you a quick demo here. This is something that one of our engineers put together. And you can see that this is just sort of an example of an algorithm that determines on the left side how text should flow inside of some arbitrary polygon. In this case, it's a star shape. And on the left, it's content flowing around the polygon. And so this is stuff that has to be really bulletproof and has to be really, really performant. And so right now, we're really focusing on optimizing those algorithms. They're going to be contributed directly to WebKit. And that's going to be the foundation on top of which we build exclusions. OK, so this is a really busy slide. I'm not going to go over all this. This would bore you guys all to death. It's too late in the day for that. But I wanted to just point out one really important element of this timeline. This is basically the full timeline of everything from when we first started thinking about regions and exclusions all the way up through the present. I really want to focus on this bottom row here, the blue row. I was at Google I/O last year, and I was working the booth, and I was demoing CSS exclusions and regions. And people would come up and take a look at it, and we had a prototype back then. It was just a prototype build, and they'd look at it, and they immediately got it, right? When you see text flowing around shapes and everything, it's awesome. And so they would say, well, wait, what browser is that? Are you using Firefox? Is that WebKit? Is that Chrome? Is that Safari? Like, what is that? And I'd say, well, this is actually our own prototype browser. This actually doesn't work anywhere. And they'd walk away kind of crestfallen and be like, damn, I kind of wanted to do that. Well, so a year later, almost exactly a year later, all of the live demos that I showed you work in the version of Chrome that all of you have on your computers right now, which is really remarkable to me. That's 1 year's time. 80% of CSS Regions has been implemented and is in Chrome and is on your computer right now. So we're making really good progress. As far as other browsers, Mozilla has committed to exclusions and regions in their 2012 roadmap. The preview version of IE10 supports regions and exclusions. And since the implementation is being done directly in WebKit, we expect the next major version of Safari to pick it up as well. I'm going to change gears a little bit here, and I want to talk about the web development workflow, something a little different. Actually, instead of talking about it, I think I'll do a little demonstration. So I'm going to open up my text editor here, and I'm going to open up a little prototype website that I am going to pretend like I'm working on. And I want to talk about the web development workflow, which typically looks something like this. You start off in your editor. You make some kind of a change. Maybe you wonder if this menu belongs at the top or not, and so you remove it. You save it. You Alt-Tab over to your browser, and you hit Command-R to reload. You say, nah, I really wanted that. You go back. You undo. You save. You go back. You reload. And if you're a web developer, which I'm assuming that all of you at least have some web development experience, if not many years of experience, you do this thousands of times a day, right? It's completely ingrained in muscle memory. And it's a pretty good workflow, right? There's no compilation process or anything like that. It's pretty fast, pretty smooth. Maybe you use something like live reload, which makes it even slicker. Now, what happens when you add mobile into that workflow, as we increasingly are? If you're building a website now, you're probably thinking about mobile to some degree. Well, you still have this, this workflow that I just described, but you have this entire additional workflow that's like pulls it down and really makes it much less efficient, right? So it looks a little something like this, right? You go through that process I just described, and then you go, okay, let me check on my device. So you pick up your device, and it's been a while, so it's locked, so you unlock it. And you're security conscious, because you're at a Google conscious conference, and so you have to enter your PIN, of course. And then you have to navigate to your browser, and then you have to type in this URL, this long, complex URL of your development machine or whatever it is, and you make at least 1 or 2 mistakes, of course. Then you fix them, and you check it out. And then when you're done with that, then you can just pick it up and hit reload. But you're still picking it up, unlocking it, hitting reload, picking up the next device, unlocking, hitting reload. And on the very last one, you're going to find a bug, right? And then you're going to go back to your desktop and fix it, and you're going to start all over again. So that really cool process that we're all very much accustomed to becomes really pretty terrible on mobile devices when you incorporate mobile devices into this web development workflow. Or I guess I shouldn't say terrible, but it's not as efficient. Let's put it that way. So Adobe looked at that problem and thought that that maybe we could do something about it. So I'm going to switch over to my browser here, and assuming that I have an internet connection, if I'm lucky. I'm going to go to the Boston Globe. I am lucky. And the reason I'm picking the Boston Globe here is because this is sort of a famously responsive website, which probably required thousands and thousands of combined hours of testing on mobile devices. So the people who built this, very smart people, and they know the pain. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and switch over to the Elmo. And I'm going to put my devices over here on the left, and I'm going to put my left anyways, and I'm going to put my desktop over here on this screen. And what you're going to see is that they're all synchronized, right? And I'm going to click on an article here, and they all follow along, right? So that same web development workflow that I showed you earlier, now I can still do with all of my devices connected. Right, I can just glance over and see. I don't have to pick them up. I don't have to change URLs. I don't have to tap on links and all that kind of thing. There's no limit to the number of devices that you can connect to here, by the way. Something else I want to point out here is Adobe Shadow, it's not like bundling up this content and pushing it out to the devices, right? Rather, it's telling the devices to go make its own request for the content. And that's an important distinction because that means that the user agent and the HTTP headers and all the information that the server needs in order to determine the correct content to send to that device, to that particular device, is all present. So you can get smaller images if you're on a smaller screen, or higher resolution images if you're on one of these nice new modern screens or whatever it is, right? So you're seeing the real deal on these devices. Let's see here. It's nice to be able to, just this much is sort of a big win, but there's even more we can do. And if I click on the little Shadow extension up here in my browser, I can do some remote inspection of my device here. And so I've now connected to my iPad, and you can see that as I start to mouse over the content in my web inspector on my desktop, you can see that it's being highlighted on my iPad over there. So this is, the kind of thing that we're accustomed to doing, on our web, when we're doing web development on our desktop, and now it extends nicely to our devices. And we can do more than just highlight. We can also change things. So I can, say something like, I can change this headline to be a little more relevant to me, right? So I just change the headline over here. I prefer something like this. I can execute some JavaScript remotely on any one of these devices. As you see, I just popped up an alert here. So I'll come over here and dismiss it. So after I've sufficiently messed up this page by vandalizing it or whatever, I can just come over here, pull it down, and refresh it. If you guys have done development on a lot of different mobile devices, you'll know that clearing the cache is actually kind of a pain, like getting a fresh copy of everything on all these different devices. And so Shadow takes care of that for you by dumping the cache and making a fresh request. Or if I want to do it to all my devices, I'll just come over here and I'll tell them all to refresh. So I'll click on that. I don't know if you saw, but they all just refreshed. It's very quick. Also, I can take screenshots of all of my devices here. I'll just click on this icon. It takes a little bit of time. Open up the directory here, and you can see that I have, this is the screenshot from my iPad, so I can compare them all, sort of check out pixels next to each other. Oh, thank you. Awesome. That is worthy of applause, I agree, thank you. This is the Galaxy Nexus here, and also some text files were created with some metadata so I can, sort of get a good feel for how something looked with a specific, URL and OS version and stuff like that. So there's Shadow. It's available right now. You can go to labs.adobe.com, download it, see if it helps for your workflow. I'm a big fan myself. Okay, I'm going to change gears again and talk a little bit about tooling. So tooling is something that Adobe is well known for. We do a lot of tooling. So when we're looking at ways we can contribute to the web, tooling was something that seemed kind of obvious. But we didn't just want to go create sort of the same old kinds of tools. We really wanted to take a fresh approach and see what kind of innovation we could bring to tooling. And so we decided to experiment with an open source code editor for the web written entirely with web technologies, just to see what would happen. And what happened was something called brackets. I'm going to go through a few bullet points here, and then I'll get to the demo. But I want to provide a little context here. First of all, it's open source. And when I say it's open source, I mean it's open source, right? Like, a lot of companies, they used to say something's open source, and we all go, oh, cool, open source, and you look at the license and be like, wait a minute. Open source is actually kind of a useless term. So really, what license? And we're releasing under an MIT license, and that's a very, very liberal license. All the code's on GitHub. Even the backlog is public. It's on a site called Trello, so you can actually go see what the team's working on. So everything is being done in the public. There's also IRC channels, and there's lists and stuff like that that you can follow. This is something that we realized kind of early on, which was kind of cool. Like this concept that if you can use brackets, you can hack on brackets. If you need brackets, if you use brackets, you can change brackets. And this point was really driven home to me when I was working on my Google I/O slides, and I realized I wanted brackets to be able to bump up the font size so that the audience could see the code while I was demoing it. But it didn't have that feature, right? It's still very, very early. I should point out this is still very, very early stages of development. So I emailed the product manager, Adam Lehman, and I said, can you guys add this by Google I/O? Or I said, are you planning on adding this by Google I/O? And he responds and he says, here's the link. Here's the link to the public backlog. You can check for yourself. And it's all public. You don't have to ask me. And actually, he didn't say that because he's a nice guy. But I went and I looked, and it wasn't scheduled. And I said, well, can you guys get it in? He said, no, but it's open source. You could get it in. And I thought, that's true. I'm really critical of editors, right? We all are. Everyone in this room is really critical about editors. And for the first time, I just had the power to make it how I wanted it. So I forked it. I mean, I'm a good JavaScript programmer. I forked it. I cloned it. I branched it, and I built a feature all in JavaScript and submitted a pull request, and it got merged, and I added the feature. And it was really empowering to be able to just change things I didn't like about the editor that I use every day. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to change that back, thank you. So brackets is intended to run outside of the browser for now, right? So we built it with web technologies, and we were first thinking, wouldn't it be awesome to take this editor and actually run it inside of a browser? We thought that might be really innovative and cool and different. And then we thought, no, probably not. We want to focus on a more traditional development experience right now and keep it outside the browser, but we're definitely looking at embedding it in the browser in the future and accessing various cloud services with it. We're not trying to build an IDE, we're trying to build a streamlined editor, right? We're not trying to compete with Visual Studio or Eclipse or something like that. We're trying to build something fast and streamlined. We want it to be an editor. And so we have a good extension model. It's an evolving extension model, which is really designed to help us keep a lot of the things that maybe everybody doesn't want out of the core product, and so people can just bring in what they want. And the last thing I want to say is that the core editor is CodeMirror, which is a separate project, which is something that we're also actively contributing to. Okay, so enough talk. Let's take a look at it. In fact, you actually have already seen it. So this is brackets. I was using it earlier. And it's a very simple editor. I mean, I have my files over here on the left, and I have my code here on the right, and I can hide my files. I have some menus up here. These are actually temporary. These menus are going to become native menus. They're just in here temporarily. But this is it. I mean, it's a relatively straightforward and simple experience, simple UI. And the point of brackets is to really sort of get out of your way. And it's to sort of break down the barriers between what it is that you intend to do and actually doing it. So if I'm looking at this piece of text right here and I decide that I want to make some kind of a change to it, let's say I want to tweak the line height of this text, then the first thing I have to start doing is dig through a bunch of CSS files, right? And I have to look at, I have to look for selector vision, I have to look for this ID, I have to look for main content or maybe article, I have to look for, maybe a container, and I have to try and find where, which styles are actually applying to this piece of text. And if this is a big project, I could have a dozen CSS files, right? They could be hundreds of lines long, and it could be a real pain, right? So as I'm, foraging sort of around looking for these rules, I'm not programming. I'm not doing what I'm intending to do. It's affecting my productivity. So instead, what I want to do is I just want my editor to do that for me. I just want to hit Command E. I just want to hit a keystroke, and I want to have my editor do that for me, right? I want to have it bring up this editor right here. This is an inline editor, and it's telling me exactly which rules apply to where my cursor was. If it's multiple documents, it'll show me the different documents right here on the right, and I can just pick the right one. And I can go down here, and I can make a change. So maybe I change this to 33. Now, this isn't just a view or a perspective of my CSS. This is an actual editor. You can see I just made a change, and now it's this file is marked as dirty here and here. And I can hit save. So I've saved it. I've actually edited the document, the CSS, inline directly in context, which is really nice. But it's not enough just to be able to edit the CSS. We actually need to be able to see what we're doing and see how it's affecting our document. So I'm going to go up here and click on this little lightning bolt, move this over to the side, hide this, and look at this. I'm going to bump up the font size. It's awesome. Oh, thanks. Thank you. And I'm going to put my browser over here on the left, and I'm going to go back down to this paragraph that I was talking about before, and I'm going to open up this editor and go down to the line height, which is what I intended to do, and I'm going to start tweaking the line height. And you can see that it's changing there on the left, right? Let me do something a little more dramatic. Let me really change it. And so while I'm actually changing it, I'm seeing what I'm doing, right? Which is going to make my workflow much more efficient. Maybe I want to change this margin down here a little bit. And so while I'm coding, I'm actually seeing in real time what's going on here, and I can just save it. Now, you might be accustomed to doing this kind of thing in something like the WebKit dev tools, right, where you're able to tweak your CSS. But the problem with that is that you're not doing that inside your editor. So you make all these changes, and there's no way to capture them back to your source files. So let me make this full screen, bring my files out here, and bring up my index page. Now, this also works with JavaScript, too. So I can scroll down to some function call here, and drop my cursor next to a function here. And if I don't remember the method signature, the function signature, I can just hit Command D. It brings up another editor. I can read the whole function, so I know what's going on. Hopefully, it's documented. In this case, it's not. But you can see how brackets is really designed to get out of your way, to break down barriers, to let you do what you intend to do, and get your features implemented as quickly and smoothly as possible. Brackets is available now. You can start playing with it. You guys can start adding features, fixing bugs, et cetera. And we'll have a URL at the end of the presentation if you want to learn more. So those are the things that Adobe has going on around text, around web development workflow, and some things we have going on around tooling. We also have a lot more going on that focuses more on graphics. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Vincent.
All right, thanks, Christian. Yes, I'm going to talk about graphics and cinematic effects for the web. One thing I want to point out is the tool we're using for the presentation is actually, it's not Keynote, or it's not PowerPoint, or it's not one of the presentation tools. It's actually Chromium, a slightly tweaked version of Chromium, but it's a web browser running full screen, and the whole presentation is written with HTML with actually a library called Visual.js, but all the slides are put together using HTML. So we're doing this in part because it's possible, of course, and also in part to test out all the things we're working on and the type of new effects we're trying to bring to the platform or that are already available on the platform. So I need to start with an example. So what you're looking at here is actually an SVG image embedded into inline an HTML document. That's something you can do today. It has a drop shadow, which is an SVG filtered applied to it. It's very subtle, so you might kind of see it around the edges of the logo. And it has a grayscale filter applied to it as well. And when I hover on it, the grayscale filter gets animated and to restore the colors. And you saw this kind of flag animation happening on the content. So this is using all kinds of filter effects. And I'll talk about the different kinds of filter effects that are applied here and how you write this. Another thing that's a little more subtle on this is happening in the interaction of the SVG image with the background. You can see there's a slightly textured background, and the image actually blends in the background in a way that you've not seen before. This is not opacity. This is actually a blend mode, and we're really combining and having an interaction between the logo and the backdrop. So how do we do this traditionally? Whoops. All right. So traditionally, this is done with authoring tools. So we do this with tools like Photoshop. We do this with tools like Illustrator or GIMP. Or we do this with tools like After Effects. Now, those tools combined let you create vector graphics. They let you define complex vector effects or filter effects, or they let you, play with meshes of coordinates in a 3D space to do effects like flags. How do you do this on the web platform, though? So this is coming to the web, and the way it's coming is through a number of filter effects. We have, at the bottom in gray, we have the text shadow and box shadow, and I have a glitch in my rendering here. I apologize for that. But so text shadow and box shadow are kind of the ancestors of the modern filter effects that are coming, and that let you do simple things, but they're available and they can be powerful. And we have the new filter property, and that starts to be implemented in the browser and starts to be used in the browser. If you've seen the keynote this morning, the Cirque du Soleil demo was using filter effects, and they're now in Chromium and they're in WebKit as well. They're also in IE for scalable vector graphics. The way you use filter effects is in one of three ways. The easiest one to start with is probably filter graphs. Those are filter defines as a set of nodes that you combine to create the effect you want, very much like you would do in a tool. The second way is through shorthands. So filter shorthands are shorthands for filter graphs. So there are some filter effects that are very common that you might want to use. And instead of repeating the same filter graph over and over again, the specification provides the shorthands for those. And then the third way is custom filters or shaders, which give you the full power and full access to the power of the GPU. It's a new proposal. It's being standardized right now, and this is what does the GPU accelerated like waving effect that we saw. So first, a few effects about what's possible today. So this is just playing with text shadow and combining multiple text shadows of different colors. You can do a neon-like effect, and when I hover on it, I get a nicer glow. It's very simple, and it's just combining CSS animation and the filter property, the text shadow property. Sorry. Similarly, you can use a box shadow. So the box shadow will apply not to a piece of text like text shadow, but to the box, the CSS box. And we can use it, for example, to attract the user's attention on where the text entry currently is. So here I have a laser saber effect on the text entry, and that helps the user. That helps the usability, and it's pretty pleasant visually. So those are available today, and people start using those on web pages. Now, let's turn to the new filter effects, the ones that are starting to be available now. The easiest way to use them is with shorthands. So if you look at the way you would write this in your CSS, you would just add a filter property. You said colon, and then you'll invoke one of the filter functions. So if we do this on this original image, and apply, for example, a grayscale filter, I just have to say, filter colon grayscale 1, and that applies a full grayscale filter. And one of the beauties of this is that I can vary the parameter in the grayscale function, and that can be subject to CSS animations and CSS transitions, making it extremely trivial to write, say, a hover effect where the image will go from grayscale to full color on hover. There's a bunch of those effects. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see that visually they provide already a pretty nice variety of things you can do. Now, oops, having problems with my navigation, sorry about this. As I said earlier, the shorthand filters are actually shorthands for filter graphs. And filter graphs come from SVG. They're now being applied to not just SVG element, but all of HTML. And the effect I'm going to show you is something that traditionally you would do in Photoshop. I remember, many years ago, I used to read those books called Photoshop Wow books, and there was one edition for each version of Photoshop. And they would explain how to do those, combination of filter effects to do something like a chiseled gold effect. And the way you would put this on your web page is you would do it in Photoshop, you export this as a PNG or a JPEG, and then insert that into your web page. Well, now you can design your filter, but you don't have to export it as a PNG. It can still be text. So here I'm going to filter a piece of text, which means that my content remains searchable, et cetera, and accessible. And I can toggle that nice gold chiseled effect. And also, since this is all declarative and it's done in markup, I can manipulate it. Dynamically in JavaScript. So here I've done something fairly simple. I hooked up one of the lighting filters in this filter graph to the position of the mouse, and as a result, when I move the mouse, the light seems to come from a different direction. So that's pretty nice flexibility. So maybe you're not putting chiseled gold on your page that often, but something that's more common is something like this, curve shadows. So curve shadow is something you see on a lot of web pages today, and the way it's implemented right now, in the best case, because there are sometimes horrible hacks, but the best case use before and after elements, boxes that are moved to the side of the box, and they're rotated. And they have a background box shadow on them. But this is a little convoluted. This is really a visual effect and belongs to filters. That turns out to be fairly simple to write in as a filter graph. And also the nice thing about it is it's very easy to manipulate through script or CSS. So here I can just manipulate one of the parameters of one of the nodes in that filter graph and have varying effects. So to give you a feel of what this looks like, here's a little code sample. And the thing that's important to note here is that I'm not going to go through all the details of that filter graph, but things to remember are you have a filter element. That's the top element here in the light blue color. And that's what you would reference from your filter property. So the filter property will point to it. And then you have a number of filter nodes that you can arrange and combine. They each produce a different effect. And at the end of the filter, you can combine and arrange those effects and stack them up in the way you want. So that's very similar, again, to what you would do in an authoring tool. And all those operations and combinations can be captured in the markup. The nice thing, again, is that since this is markup, this is part of the DOM, and the DOM is accessible through scripts, and you can make it all dynamic. So now let's move to the last type of shaders. So CSS shaders are used through the filter function again, except that you're using a new syntax for the value. So instead of having a shorthand or pointing to a filter graph, we use a custom function. Before we dive into this, this is what the kind of things it does. So here you see when I hover, I start applying a custom filter effect, and the two things happening are first the rendering gets distorted. It has this nice curvy effect applied to it. And that's what vertex shaders do. So this is about distorting geometry and moving vertices around. And the second thing you can notice is there is a fairly subtle effect, a shading effect on the rendering. So the original element that we're filtering is all white. And here you can see there are shades of gray. And that's what fragment shaders or pixel shaders do for you. The other thing I should mention is, shaders run on the GPU, so this is, usually very fast. So the model for CSS shaders is that the conceptual model, when you use it and you want to author it or just use CSS shaders, is that think of it as your content being rendered into an off-screen image, and then a mesh of points or vertices is mapped onto this off-screen rendering. And what the vertex shader lets you do is manipulate those mesh points or mesh vertices in a 3D space. And that gives you the ability to do all kinds of extremely beautiful distortions in a 3D space. And that's the end of step 2. That's what the vertex shader produces. And then the last step is that you can manipulate pixel values. So once you've distorted the geometry all you want, you can then apply the values on the pixel colors, and more precisely, you can produce pixel colors that will be combined with the rendered content. So let's look at how to use shaders step by step. So again, very simple. You use a custom function, and you pass parameters to it. If we zoom into what the parameters are, the only required parameter is the vertex shader. This is the only thing that's required. So if you want to just pass the vertex shader, that's fine. There's an optional parameter, which is a fragment shader that will manipulate the pixel values. Then you specify the vertex mesh. So the vertex mesh is the granularity you want for how many points you want to be able to manipulate that will be mapped on top of your rendering. Depending on the effect, you may want more or less of them. And then finally, and this is very powerful, you can pass parameters to vertex shaders. And those parameters can then be animated through CSS transitions and CSS animations. Sorry. All right. So let's look at step by step. If I use only a vertex shader and the size of the vertex mesh, here's how it looks. If on the left-hand side is the thing I want to filter, on top of it, I've drawn the vertex mesh, or something that symbolizes the vertex mesh. Those little gray square represent the vertex mesh. So I've asked for a vertex mesh that's two rows and 2 columns. So I have 9 vertices to manipulate. And now on the right-hand side, you can see that all those vertices have been moved by my vertex shader, and as a result, I get this distortion that gives the impression that my element has been folded in 2. Now, what if I wanted to do something a little more sophisticated and give it a little more realistic look? Like if I wanted the thing to be darker and at the where the fold happens in the center, and just regular coloring on the edges. Well, that's when I would start using a fragment shader. So here, I've added this fragment shader, and what the fragment shader does is that it looks at the current coordinate of the rendering, and will produce a darker value in the center and a lighter value on the edges. And this gets combined with the rendering and provides this very nice shading effect. And I mentioned earlier that passing parameter was a useful feature and a powerful feature in shaders. So here we have the same shaders we had in the previous example, the one fold and vertex shader and the fragment shader. But I'm now passing a parameter that controls the amount of folding I do. And the more I fold, the bigger the amount, the more the bigger the effect, and the bigger the shading in the center. So since this can be manipulated through scripts, I have hooked up a little slider here. And if I go to the left, I'll have less of the effect, and you see how the code changes. And if I move to the right, I'll go to the full extent of the effect. And there's no limit on which parameters you pass and the type of parameters. The specification offers a wide variety of parameters. You can pass matrices, colors, transforms, all kinds of things, which can then be manipulated through CSS and scripts as well. So it's pretty powerful things, and this is a simple example, but I'm hoping people will do really crazy things with a feature. I want to give a little taste of what the code looks like. the syntax and the language that's used for writing those little programs that will act on vertices or on pixel values the language is GLSL. So it's the same language that is used in WebGL for when you write shaders for WebGL. So a vertex shader, at the end of the day, if you look at line 13, that's what a vertex shader does. The main function of the shader, which starts on line 7, its whole role is to compute a GL position, and that's basically how you want to displace the vertex that's being processed. And it's called once for every vertex. So if you want to learn more about GLSL, there are ample documentation on the web for WebGL, but also for OpenGLES, because that's the same exact language. It's C-like, it's a little different, but it's not that hard, and there are lots of examples to start from. Fragment shaders or pixel shaders, similarly, it's the same language as for GLSL. There's a slight difference. It's actually not that slight. There is a difference with regular fragment shaders that you would use in WebGL or OpenGLES. Is the output of the filter is not a GL frag color. If you're a graphic expert, you're familiar with that value, which is the typical role of a fragment shader. In our case, and for security reasons, what we produce is a pixel value that is then combined with a rendered output. There has been a lot of work done on making CSS shaders secure, and the result of this was that with this modification, we don't give access to the rendered content to shaders, and as a result, they're safe, and they can still do all the use cases that we've thought about so far. Now, we don't expect people to write as many shaders as they will use shaders. We expect that we'll have, for example, we plan to provide shaders that people can start experimenting with. We expect that experts will write nice shaders with a set of well-documented parameters that a lot of people can use. And one of the things we've started to think about is, well, how can we make it easy for people to configure a shader the way they want and make it look exactly right? So this is what the CSS Shader Studio does, and I'll show you a few examples of that tool. So here we're in this prototype tool. It's not an application or a tool that we would sell or anything. It's a demo tool, and on the left-hand side you have a set of shaders. When you select one, the user interface provides you the parameters that you can configure for the shader. So those are, if you remember the syntax, the parameters you pass at the end of the custom function. In the center, you see a prototype like rendering that's affected by the shader. And at the bottom, there is a timeline that lets you animate the different values for the shader. So before the presentation, I prepared one on this warp filter we have. And I set it up so that at time 0, I've set up the warp the way I wanted with this little UI that lets me move the vertices visually. And at the end of the animation, it's restored to its state. And now if I run it, I'll have kind of a transition effect that I may want to put on my web page when I'm showing up a new piece of information, for example. So that's a warp filter. There are all kinds of different effects you could do. Rolling scroll is one of my favorite. If I go back here, I've predefined it, and if I move the roll ratio, for example, I can do the effect I want. And again, if I run it, it's going to show me a preview of the type of effect I might want. We can also do things like shuffling tiles, for example, here, where when I move, I can kind of explode the content, and that's because when I move the vertices of on the vertex mesh, I have the option of keeping them attached, in which case it's like distorting a piece of rubber. But I have also the option of having detached tiles or detached tiles on the rendering. And if I have many of them, I can have a nice particle effect like we were seeing here. So the idea here is to make it a visual experience like you do for when you're trying to create a gradient, except it's a little more complicated in this case. And the tool will provide, the nice syntax that you can just cut and paste into your, CSS page, your CSS file. And if you want to do the animation effect itself, you can just grab it here. We export the exact syntax that would need to go into the CSS file again. So hopefully that type of visual tool will help people start using the feature and make it painless and visually interesting to create them. So this tool is not yet available, but we're planning to make it available later this year so that people can look at it and experiment with shaders easily. All right, so another effect or visual effect that we're working on is around texturing and blending. So blending is something that's very common in graphic packages like Photoshop or GIMP. The idea of texturing is to control how what you draw blends or mixes with where you draw. So you draw something and you want it to interact with the backdrop. So currently we have opacity. So if I use opacity on a menu like this, like I have my Home About Products menu, I use opacity and I kind of see the background behind, and that's nice, but it makes it a little washed out, and it's not quite what you want, and it's not quite what graphic designers want because they're used to those nice blend modes that they have in tools like Photoshop again. So we're working on a new proposal. It's actually not that new proposal. It's it's a feature that has been in SVG for a while, but that is now being brought to the larger CSS and HTML. And it's CSS compositing and blending. And it can do things like this. So now what I've done is I've turned on a blend mode. It's a color burn mode. And the blue that I have now interacts in a different way with the background. And just to show that this is not just images, the way people do this kind of effect today on the web is that they design it in Photoshop, they export a bunch of images, and then they put it on the page. Here I have a CSS animation on the color, and you can see that the color animation happens and produces a new rendering for the menu item, and that gets blended in with the background. I didn't have to swap 1,000 bitmaps to do so. Using blending and compositing is made with two properties. It's extremely simple. I have two small demos. So what you see here in the backdrop is what we're drawing on top of. And we're drawing this yellow bar on top of those three elements. The way you specify it is very straightforward. You have an alpha compositing property, and by default, it's source over. It's a little bit of a technical term, but that just means draw what I draw on top of the background. And that's so far that's no surprise. But I have a bunch of options, and I can say I just want destination over, for example, will draw what I'm drawing behind the backdrop. I can do source in, destin. I mean, there's a bunch of different effects that you can use that will combine in different ways with the background. So that's the first of two properties. The second one is blend mode. So again, if I'm trying to combine a foreground and a background in various ways, I just use the blend mode property. And by default, it's normal, meaning that the colors don't interact. But I can change it to something like plus, multiply, color dodge, or difference, and have various effects. And those are exactly the ones you would find in graphic packages today. Thank you. So far we've proposed all this and worked with the community and the working groups in W3C to bring this to CSS. We're working on possibly contributing this or proposing this for Canvas as well. And we've done a prototype of this that I'll show quickly. It's in, this is a really bleeding edge prototype we've done in Firefox, in a nightly build of Firefox. And what you see is basically the same concept, but in Canvas. At the bottom of the screen here, we have the code. I'm drawing two images, and the first one is the background, which is a visual canvas. Then I change the compositing operation to be an overlay, a multiply mode, blend mode. And I then draw this kind of colorful graphics on top of it. and I get this better, nicer integration with my background. So this is something that's, again, very bleeding edge, but we're considering offering this property for this different graphics model than Canvas is. All right, so the things we talked about today is that the world of the web developers and of creatives has been intersecting. There's been features, but there's not been that many of them in the past, and we're trying to increase that intersection between the two so that there is a lot more happening on the web and a lot more features available to developers. So this is really the area we're focusing on now, is trying to make this area larger and try to provide more tools for this area. Because we believe that if we do this, we'll have a lot more expressivity on the platform, meaning that you can express a lot more in the markup in your CSS or your HTML. That will make everybody more creative. And we think there's an opportunity for a new, new generation of tools and new ways of interacting between creatives and developers. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you have questions, we are probably going to be able to take one or two, but we can also talk after the end of the sessions. Thank you very much.